Pack your things and get out. I never loved you, Marcus. Not once in 15 years. The words hit me like a sledgehammer to the chest as I stood in our kitchen doorway, still holding the anniversary flowers I'd brought home. Victoria didn't even look up from her laptop as she delivered the killing blow. Trevor's moving in this weekend. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The coffee mug slipped from my other hand, shattering against the marble floor we'd picked out together 3 years ago. Victoria finally glanced up, her green eyes cold as winter frost. The same eyes that used to light up when I walked through the door were now looking at me like I was something unpleasant she'd found on her shoe. "Trevor?" My voice came out as a croak. I knew exactly who she meant. Trevor Blackstone, her personal trainer. The guy with the perfect abs and the motorcycle who'd been coming to our house twice a week for the past 6 months. The guy I'd been writing checks to, paying for my wife's fitness sessions, while he was apparently working out more than just her glutes. Yes, Trevor. Victoria's voice carried that sharp edge of impatience she usually reserved for telemarketers. "He understands me in ways you never could. He appreciates me. He doesn't spend his days buried in boring spreadsheets like some hermit." Boring spreadsheets? My consulting firm, Meridian Analytics, was one of the most successful boutique financial advisory companies in Chicago. Those boring spreadsheets had paid for this 4-bedroom house in Lincoln Park, her Mercedes in the driveway, the luxury vacations to Tuscany and the Maldives. Those spreadsheets had bought the emerald ring sparkling on her finger as she typed what I now realized was probably a love letter to another man. "Victoria, what are you saying?" I set the flowers on the counter, my hand shaking. "We can work through this. Marriage counseling, whatever you need. 15 years doesn't just disappear because you're going through a phase." A phase. The word hung in the air like smoke from a house fire. Victoria laughed, a sound devoid of any warmth I'd ever heard from her. It was the laugh of a stranger wearing my wife's face. "A phase? Marcus, you really don't get it, do you?" She closed the laptop with a decisive snap. "This isn't some midlife crisis or whatever you want to call it. I've been planning this for months. Trevor and I are in love, real love, not this comfortable roommate situation we've been pretending is a marriage." Comfortable roommate situation. I thought about the anniversary trip to Paris I'd planned for next month, the surprise renewal ceremony I'd secretly arranged with her sister's help. The ring I'd had custom designed was sitting in my office safe, waiting for the right moment. Apparently, there wouldn't be one. "But we just renewed the mortgage," I said stupidly, as if financial logistics could somehow hold together a marriage that was crumbling in real time. "The new kitchen renovation, your art studio in the basement. We planned all of this together." "You planned it," Victoria corrected, standing up from the breakfast bar. She was wearing the yoga outfit I'd bought her for Christmas, the expensive Lululemon set that had cost more than most people's monthly grocery budget. "You decided we needed a bigger mortgage. You decided I need an art studio. You decided we should stay in Chicago instead of moving to California like I wanted." Moving to California. She'd mentioned it exactly once, 2 years ago, after her sister relocated to San Diego. I'd explained the financial implications, how my business was rooted in Chicago, how starting over would cost us years of financial progress. She'd nodded and never brought it up again. I thought we'd moved past it. "I thought we agreed Chicago was better for our future," I said, feeling like I was grasping at smoke. "Your pottery classes are here, your friends, our whole life." "Our life." Victoria walked to the window overlooking our backyard, where the pool I'd installed last summer reflected the late afternoon sun. "You mean your life, Marcus. Your schedule, your priorities, your definition of success. When was the last time you asked me what I wanted? Really asked, not just assumed I'd go along with whatever financial plan you'd calculated would optimize our net worth." The accusation stung because there was truth in it. I was a planner, an optimizer. It's what made me successful in business and what I thought would make me a good provider. Every major decision went through my mental spreadsheet of costs, benefits, and long-term implications. It had never occurred to me that Victoria might interpret careful planning as control. "I was building security for us," I said, though the words sounded hollow even to me. "Everything I did was for our future together." "No, Marcus. Everything you did was for your vision of our future. You never asked if I shared that vision." Victoria turned back to face me, and for a moment I saw something that might have been sadness flicker across her features. "Do you know what I wanted to do when I was 25, before I met you?" I searched my memory desperately. We'd met at a coffee shop near Northwestern where I was finishing my MBA and she was working as a barista while taking art classes. She'd talked about wanting to teach, maybe open our own studio someday. Dreams that had somehow gotten buried under mortgage payments and retirement planning. "You wanted to teach art," I said quietly. "I wanted to teach art in a small town somewhere warm where I could have a little studio and maybe a garden. Somewhere simple, where success wasn't measured by the size of your investment portfolio." Her voice carried a wistfulness I hadn't heard in years. "But you had plans, big plans. Corporate consulting, aggressive savings rates, early retirement through careful wealth building. And I got swept up in it all." I remembered those early conversations, how impressed she'd seemed with my ambition and financial acumen, how she'd called me driven and successful when other women had found me too serious or boring. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story. I'd thought she shared my goals, that we wanted the same things. "You never said you were unhappy," I protested. "All these years, you never told me you felt trapped." "I tried, Marcus. God, how many times I tried." Victoria's voice rose with frustration. "But every time I brought up something I wanted to do, you'd pull out those charts and graphs showing how it would impact our financial timeline. Remember when I wanted to take that ceramics workshop in Santa Fe? You calculated how the time off work and travel expenses would delay our investment goals by 6 months. I did remember. The workshop was expensive, poorly timed with her work schedule, and would have required dipping into our emergency fund. The responsible choice was obvious. But looking at Victoria's face now, I realized I'd calculated everything except the cost of disappointing my wife. "That was just being practical," I said weakly. "That was you deciding that your definition of practical mattered more than my dreams." Victoria walked to the refrigerator and pulled out a bottle of wine, the expensive Bordeaux we'd been saving for a special occasion. She opened it without ceremony and poured herself a generous glass. "You want to know when I started falling out of love with you? It was 3 years ago, when I told you I wanted to take a sabbatical and travel through Europe, maybe take some art courses in Florence. Do you remember what you said?" The memory hit me like a physical blow. She'd brought it up during dinner, eyes bright with excitement as she showed me brochures for art schools in Italy. I'd pulled up our financial projections on my tablet, showing her how a year off work would push back our retirement timeline by nearly 3 years. I said it wasn't financially viable at that stage of our wealth accumulation, I whispered. "You said my dreams weren't financially viable." Victoria took a long sip of wine. "That night, lying in bed next to you, I realized I was married to a calculator that occasionally made conversation about stock market performance." The words hit harder than any physical blow could have. I'd spent 15 years thinking I was being a responsible husband, providing security and building a stable future. Instead, I'd been slowly suffocating the woman I loved with spreadsheets and optimization strategies. "So you decided to have an affair with your personal trainer?" The bitterness in my voice surprised even me. "I decided to remember what it felt like to be alive," Victoria shot back. "Trevor doesn't analyze the cost-benefit ratio of spontaneous adventures. When I told him I wanted to see the sunrise from Lake Michigan, he picked me up at 5 in the morning with coffee and donuts. When I mentioned wanting to try rock climbing, he took me to a climbing gym that weekend. He doesn't treat every conversation like a board meeting." "Trevor, the personal trainer who I'd been paying $200 a week to spend time with my wife. The irony was so sharp it could cut glass. I'd been funding my own betrayal, writing checks to the man who was stealing my marriage while I optimized our investment portfolio. "How long?" I asked, though I wasn't sure I wanted to know the answer. 4 months. Victoria's honesty was like a knife twist. "Since the day you canceled our anniversary dinner because you had to work late on the Steinberg acquisition analysis. Trevor brought me Thai food and we watched movies until midnight. He listened when I talked about wanting to paint again. He didn't lecture me about the cost of art supplies affecting our discretionary spending budget." The Steinberg acquisition. A routine analysis that I could have finished the next morning, but I'd been in the zone, the numbers flowing perfectly. I'd texted Victoria that I'd make it up to her, that we'd do something special the following weekend. We'd ended up going to that expensive steakhouse downtown where I'd spent half the dinner checking my phone for market updates. "I'm sorry," I said, and meant it. "I know I've been focused on work, but I thought you understood that everything I was building was for us." "No, Marcus. Everything you were building was for some theoretical future version of us that you'd calculated would be happier once we hit certain financial milestones." Victoria finished her wine and set the glass down with finality. "I didn't want to wait until age 55 to start living. I wanted to live now, with someone who could be present for actual life instead of constantly planning for some optimized future that might never come." She was right, and that realization felt like falling into cold water. I'd been so focused on building financial security that I'd forgotten to actually live in the present with my wife. Every vacation had been planned around market timing. Every major purchase had been analyzed to death. Every spontaneous idea had been filtered through the lens of long-term financial impact. "What happens now?" I asked, though I already knew the answer was going to destroy me. "Now you pack your things and move out." Victoria's voice returned to that cold efficiency. "The divorce papers will be filed Monday morning. My lawyer says with no kids and separate business assets, it should be straightforward. You can keep your precious consulting firm and your investment accounts. I just want my freedom." Freedom. The word echoed in my head as I tried to process what was happening. Victoria wanted freedom from our life together, from the financial security I'd worked so hard to build, from me. She was choosing a personal trainer's spontaneity over 15 years of marriage and millions of dollars in carefully accumulated wealth. "Just like that?" I asked. 15 years and you're throwing it all away for a guy who probably can't even spell portfolio?" "I'm not throwing anything away," Victoria replied, her green eyes flashing with anger. "I'm finally picking up the pieces of the person I used to be before I got buried under your financial planning obsession. Trevor might not have your education or the bank account, but he knows how to live in the moment. He knows how to make me feel like a woman instead of a line item in a budget spreadsheet." Line item in a budget spreadsheet. The accusation hit home because I could literally picture Victoria's personal expenses categorized in my monthly financial reports. Clothing allowance, entertainment budget, health and wellness spending. I'd reduced my wife to data points and optimization opportunities. "Where am I supposed to go?" I asked, though I already knew the answer was going to destroy me. "Now, you pack your things and move out." Victoria's voice returned to that cold efficiency. "The divorce papers will be filed Monday morning. My lawyer says with no kids and separate business assets, it should be straightforward. You can keep your precious consulting firm and your investment accounts. I just want my freedom." Freedom. The word echoed in my head as I tried to process what was happening. Victoria wanted freedom from our life together, from the financial security I'd worked so hard to build, from me. She was choosing a personal trainer's spontaneity over 15 years of marriage and millions of dollars in carefully accumulated wealth. "Just like that?" I asked, and the bitterness in my voice was like a knife. 15 years and you're throwing it all away for a guy who probably can't even spell portfolio? "I'm not throwing anything away," Victoria replied, her green eyes flashing with anger. "I'm finally picking up the pieces of the person I used to be before I got buried under your financial planning obsession. Trevor might not have your education or the bank account, but he knows how to live in the moment. He knows how to make me feel like a woman instead of a line item in a budget spreadsheet." Line item in a budget spreadsheet. The accusation hit home because I could literally picture Victoria's personal expenses categorized in my monthly financial reports: clothing allowance, entertainment budget, health and wellness spending. I'd reduced my wife to data points and optimization opportunities. "Where am I supposed to go?" I asked. The question came out more vulnerable than I intended. "I don't know, Marcus. Maybe now you can experience what it's like to make spontaneous decisions without running them through your financial calculator first." Victoria's voice carried a cruelty I'd never heard from her before. "There's a hotel downtown. Use your precious emergency fund for something actually urgent for once."
Emergency fund. $300,000 sitting in a high-yield savings account, earning optimal interest while waiting for genuine catastrophes. I'd never imagined that the emergency would be my wife kicking me out for another man. I looked around our kitchen, taking in the marble countertops, the professional-grade appliances, the custom cabinetry that had cost more than most people's cars. All of it had been carefully planned, meticulously budgeted, optimized for both function and investment value. None of it had been enough to keep my wife happy. "I'll need a few days to find a place," I said, trying to maintain some dignity in the face of complete humiliation. "You have until Sunday," Victoria replied, already walking toward the stairs. "Trevor's moving his things in Monday morning, and I don't want this to be awkward for him." Awkward for him. My wife was worried about making her lover comfortable in the house I'd worked 70-hour weeks to afford. The personal trainer, who probably made in a year what I earned in a month, was going to be sleeping in the bed where Victoria and I had planned our future together. "What about counseling?" I called after her, desperation making my voice crack. "We haven't even tried to work through this." Victoria paused at the bottom of the stairs, her hand resting on the banister I'd custom-ordered from that craftsman in Wisconsin. For a moment, I thought I saw something soften in her expression. "Marcus, I've been trying to work through this for 3 years," she said quietly. "Every time I tried to talk to you about feeling disconnected, you'd show me our net worth statements like that was supposed to fix everything. You can't solve a marriage with compound interest calculations." Then she was gone, her footsteps echoing up the hardwood stairs that had cost $40,000 to install. I stood alone in our kitchen, surrounded by everything I'd thought represented success, feeling like the biggest failure who'd ever lived. The flowers I'd brought were still lying on the counter, their bright yellow faces a mockery of the celebration I'd planned. 15 years of marriage. Gone, because I'd forgotten that love couldn't be optimized like a stock portfolio. My wife was upstairs, probably texting with Trevor about their plans to redecorate our bedroom. The life I'd spent decades building had collapsed in a single conversation. But as I sat in downtown traffic, something unexpected happened. Instead of immediately calculating the financial implications of divorce proceedings and asset division, I found myself wondering what Victoria had meant about learning to live in the moment. For the first time in years, I didn't have a spreadsheet solution for my problems. Maybe that wasn't entirely a bad thing. The hotel lobby was elegant and expensive, the kind of place I would have chosen after careful research and price comparison. But tonight, I'd booked it impulsively, without analyzing the cost-benefit ratio or reading customer reviews. The decision felt foreign and slightly terrifying, like speaking a language I'd never learned. As I checked in, the desk clerk mentioned that the rooftop bar was open until midnight and offered excellent views of the city. The old Marcus would have declined, citing the need to review financial documents or prepare for client meetings. Tonight, I found myself asking if they had good whiskey. "The best," she assured me with a smile. I took the elevator to my room, dropped my bags, and immediately went back down to the rooftop. The Chicago skyline spread out before me like a circuit board of lights, beautiful and complicated and alive with possibilities I'd never noticed while buried in spreadsheets. I ordered an expensive whiskey without checking the price, another small act of rebellion against my own nature.
The bartender was a young woman with bright purple hair and an art degree she was probably paying off with tips from business travelers like me. "Celebrating or commiserating?" she asked, noticing my wedding ring, which I hadn't yet had the presence of mind to remove. "I'm honestly not sure," I replied, which was the most honest thing I'd said all day. She poured the whiskey and slid it across the bar. "Sometimes the best nights are the ones where you don't know which it is." I drank the whiskey and looked out at the city lights, thinking about Victoria and Trevor planning their spontaneous new life together. For the first time in 15 years, I had no idea what came next, and maybe that was exactly what I needed to figure out. The alcohol burned warm in my chest, and I realized I was about to discover who Marcus really was when he wasn't hiding behind financial projections and optimization strategies. The thought was terrifying and exhilarating in equal measure. My phone buzzed with a text message. For a moment, my heart jumped, thinking it might be Victoria having second thoughts. Instead, it was my assistant reminding me about Monday morning's client presentation, the Weinstein Group acquisition analysis that had consumed my weekend while my marriage was falling apart. I stared at the message for a long moment, then did something I'd never done in my professional career. I typed back, "Cancel it. Family emergency." It wasn't entirely a lie. My family was having an emergency, even if it was an emergency of my own making. For the first time in my career, the spreadsheets would have to wait. I had more important things to figure out, like how to become the kind of man who can inspire love instead of just financial security. I ordered another whiskey and settled in to watch the city lights, wondering if it was too late to learn how to live spontaneously. Victoria and Trevor thought they had won, that they'd escaped the boring financial planner for a more exciting life together. What they didn't know was that the boring financial planner had just made his first impulsive decision in 15 years, and it felt dangerous in the best possible way. The whiskey had worn off by morning, but the clarity remained. I woke up in the hotel room at 6:30, my body's internal clock refusing to acknowledge that my life had fundamentally changed overnight. For a moment, lying in the unfamiliar bed, I almost reached for my phone to check the overnight market performance. Then I remembered that Victoria was probably waking up next to Trevor in our bedroom, and the market suddenly seemed irrelevant. I ordered room service instead of calculating the cost difference between hotel breakfast and nearby restaurants. The decision felt like a small rebellion against 15 years of automatic optimization. When the coffee arrived, it was overpriced and mediocre, but I drank it anyway while staring out at Lake Michigan, trying to figure out who I was supposed to be now. My phone showed 17 missed calls from my assistant, Elena, and a string of increasingly frantic text messages about the canceled Weinstein presentation. The old Marcus would have been calculating the revenue loss and client relationship damage. The new Marcus deleted the messages without reading them all. But Victoria's words kept echoing in my head about learning to live spontaneously. What did that even mean for someone whose entire adult life had been built around careful analysis and strategic planning? I'd been optimizing decisions for so long that I wasn't sure I remembered how to make impulsive choices that might not be perfectly rational. The irony wasn't lost on me that I was now analyzing how to be spontaneous, which defeated the entire purpose. I finished the coffee and made a decision that surprised even me. Instead of calling Elena back or reviewing the quarterly reports waiting on my laptop, I Googled things to do in Chicago today like a tourist in my own city. The Art Institute had a new exhibition on contemporary sculpture. Navy Pier was hosting some kind of music festival. There were architecture tours, food tours, boat tours, all the activities I'd lived alongside for 15 years without ever participating in. When had I last visited a museum that wasn't hosting a business networking event? When had I done anything purely for enjoyment rather than professional advancement or relationship maintenance? I chose the Art Institute partly because Victoria had always wanted us to go together, and I'd always found reasons to postpone. Work deadlines, client emergencies, market volatility that required monitoring. There had always been something more important than wandering through galleries looking at art that wouldn't improve our financial position. The museum was different than I'd expected, quieter, more contemplative, filled with people who moved slowly and looked carefully at things that existed purely for beauty rather than function. I found myself standing in front of a Monet painting, trying to understand what Victoria saw in art that I'd never been able to appreciate. The colors shifted and blended in ways that reminded me of market volatility charts, but somehow more gentle, more forgiving. There was no optimization here, no efficiency to be gained or lost. The painting simply existed, beautiful and impractical and completely unnecessary for any form of measurable success. A woman next to me was sketching the painting in a small notebook, her hand moving with practiced confidence. She was probably Victoria's age, with graying hair and paint stains on her fingers that suggested serious artistic commitment rather than hobby dabbling. "It's different every time you look at it," she said, noticing my prolonged stare. Monet understood that light changes everything, even when the subject stays the same. I never really looked at art before, I admitted, which felt like confessing to some fundamental character flaw. My wife always wanted to, but I was usually too busy. "Used to be married to someone who didn't understand art," she replied with a knowing smile. "He thought it was frivolous and practical. Turned out he was frivolous and impractical. Art endures." Her casual dismissal of her ex-husband stung, probably because I recognized myself in the description. How many times had I dismissed Victoria's art interest as cute hobbies rather than genuine passions? How often had I calculated the cost of art supplies or studio space without considering the value of creative fulfillment? I spent 3 hours in the museum, which was probably longer than I'd spent on any non-work activity in months. By the time I left, my phone was buzzing with urgent messages about rescheduled meetings and client concerns, but I found myself walking toward Grant Park instead of heading back to handle business crises. The park was full of people who seemed to have mastered the art of existing without obvious purpose. Joggers, dog walkers, families feeding ducks, couples holding hands while walking nowhere in particular. I sat on a bench and watched them, trying to understand how they'd learned how to move through the world without constantly calculating the return on investment of their time and energy. A father was teaching his daughter to ride a bicycle, running alongside her wobbly attempts with infinite patience. He wasn't measuring her progress against developmental milestones or analyzing the cost-effectiveness of different learning techniques. He was just present, encouraging, celebrating small victories that would never appear on any performance metric. Victoria and I had talked about having children early in our marriage. We'd even done the financial planning, calculating the optimal timing for maximum career advancement and minimum retirement delay. But the optimal timing had never arrived. There was always another business milestone to reach, another financial goal to achieve first.
Now I wondered if we'd been planning for a future that required being present for the journey, not just the destination. My phone rang. Elena again. This time I answered. "Marcus, thank God!" Her voice carried the sharp edge of professional crisis management. "The Weinstein Group is furious about the cancellation. Davidson called 3 times this morning, and the Hartwell merger analysis is due tomorrow. Where are you?" "I'm in Grant Park," I said, watching the father celebrate his daughter's first successful solo ride around the fountain. "Grant Park? Are you sick? Should I reschedule everything for the rest of the week?" Was I sick? Maybe. Sick of optimizing every moment, sick of treating human relationships like portfolio management problems, sick of being the kind of person whose wife would rather run away with a personal trainer than spend another day being married to a calculator. "Cancel everything until Thursday," I heard myself say. "Family emergency." "Marcus, the Hartwell analysis represents $200,000 in billings. If we don't deliver tomorrow, they'll find another firm." $200,000. 3 months ago, that number would have sent me sprinting back to the office to work through the night if necessary. Today, watching the father swing his daughter around in celebration of her bicycle achievement, it seemed less important than learning what I'd been missing while buried in spreadsheets. "Then they'll find another firm," I said, surprising myself with how easily the words came. "Sometimes other things matter more than billable hours." Elena's silence stretched long enough that I wondered if the call had dropped. Finally, she spoke with the careful tone reserved for managing unstable clients. "Marcus, are you sure you're feeling all right? This isn't like you at all." She was right. It wasn't like me. The old Marcus would never have chosen a park bench over a $200,000 client deadline. But the old Marcus had also lost his wife to a personal trainer because he'd forgotten that human beings needed more than financial security to be happy. "I'm feeling different," I said. "Maybe that's not entirely bad." After hanging up, I sat in the park until sunset, something I hadn't done since college. The city transformed around me as office workers emerged from buildings, heading home to families and lives that existed beyond quarterly reports and performance metrics. I wondered how many of them had learned the balance I'd never found, how to be successful without sacrificing everything else that mattered. When I finally returned to the hotel, there was a message from Victoria. Not a text, but an actual voicemail, which meant she'd wanted to say something too complex for typing. My finger hovered over the play button for several minutes before I found the courage to listen. "Marcus, it's me. I just wanted to make sure you were okay. I know yesterday was brutal, and I'm sorry it had to happen that way. I found some of your mail on the counter, bank statements and investment reports. I had no idea how much money you'd accumulated. $3 million, Marcus? When were you planning to mention that we were actually wealthy? I thought we were just comfortable. But you've been hiding a fortune while lecturing me about discretionary spending budgets. Call me back. We need to talk about this." $3 million. The number I'd been carefully building through aggressive savings and strategic investments, the financial foundation I'd planned to reveal when we hit our early retirement target in 8 more years. The surprise that was supposed to demonstrate how well my careful planning had served our future together. Victoria had always known we were financially stable, but I'd kept the full scope of our wealth private. Partly because I'd wanted it to be a surprise, and partly because I'd worried that knowing about the money might make her less motivated to maintain the disciplined spending habits that had made accumulating it possible. Now she'd discovered it in the worst possible way, while going through my personal papers after kicking me out. She'd found evidence that her husband had been sitting on enough money to fund any dream she'd ever mentioned, while simultaneously telling her those dreams weren't financially viable. The ceramics workshop in Santa Fe that I'd calculated would delay our investment timeline, we could have afforded 50 of them without meaningful impact. The sabbatical year in Europe that I deemed too expensive, a rounding error against our actual net worth. Her desire to move to California and open an art studio, easily achievable with the money I'd been hiding in investment accounts she didn't know existed. I'd been so focused on reaching some arbitrary financial goal that I'd sacrificed our present happiness to fund a future she'd never agreed to want. Victoria had spent 3 years feeling guilty about wanting experiences we could easily afford, while I'd been secretly accumulating more wealth than most people would see in a lifetime. The realization made me physically sick. I'd been lying to my wife, not directly, but through omission and misdirection. Every time she'd suggested something that cost money, I'd framed it as a sacrifice that would hurt our long-term financial health. Meanwhile, I'd been quietly building an investment portfolio that could have funded any lifestyle she'd ever imagined. No wonder she'd fallen in love with Trevor. At least his financial limitations were honest. When he suggested spontaneous adventures, the constraints were real, not artificially imposed by a husband who was secretly hoarding money while pretending they needed to budget carefully. I called her back immediately. "Marcus," Victoria's voice was guarded, uncertain. "I got your message. You're right. We need to talk." $3 million, Marcus. $3 million. Do you understand what that means? All those times I felt guilty for wanting things, all those conversations about waiting until we were more financially stable, and you were sitting on $3 million? "I was building our future," I said weakly, knowing how inadequate that sounded. "You were building your future. The future you decided we should want without consulting me about whether I actually wanted it." Victoria's voice carried a hurt that went deeper than betrayal. "Marcus, with that kind of money, I could have had my art studio, we could have traveled, we could have moved to California, we could have done everything I ever dreamed. Instead, you let me believe we needed to pinch pennies and delay gratification." She was right.
and the truth of it was devastating. I'd been so obsessed with reaching some magic number that would guarantee financial independence that I'd ignored the fact that we'd already reached a level of wealth that could have funded happiness immediately. "Why?" she asked, and I could hear tears in her voice. "Why would you hide something that important from your own wife?" The question hung in the air like an accusation. Why had I hidden our wealth? The honest answer was complicated and unflattering. I'd liked being the responsible one, the financial guardian who made the hard decisions about spending and saving. I'd enjoyed this secret knowledge that I was protecting our future, even when Victoria couldn't see the bigger picture. But deeper than that, I'd been afraid that knowing about the money would change her, that she'd become careless with spending, that she'd lose respect for the discipline that had made accumulating it possible, that she'd want to use it for things I couldn't control or optimize. "I wanted to surprise you," I said, which was true but incomplete. "When we hit 5 million, I was going to reveal everything and propose early retirement." 5 million? Marcus, we already have enough money to retire. We have enough money to do anything we want. How much is enough for you? How much was enough? I'd never seriously considered the question. Every financial milestone had simply led to the next one, each goal replaced by a larger target that always seemed just out of reach. 3 million had become 5 million, 5 million would have become 10 million, and so on until we were old and wealthy and had missed our entire lives in pursuit of some impossible definition of financial security. "I don't know," I admitted. "I never thought about it that way." "Of course you didn't. You thought about it like a game where the score kept getting higher, but you never considered what we were supposed to do with the score." Victoria's voice carried exhaustion beyond anger. "Marcus, I've been living like a poor person married to a secret millionaire. Do you understand how that makes me feel?" I was beginning to. Victoria had been denying herself experiences and opportunities, while I'd been optimizing our investment portfolio and feeling proud of our financial discipline. She'd been living with artificial constraints, while I'd been building wealth we didn't actually need for any realistic definition of security. "I'm sorry," I said, meaning it more than I'd ever meant anything. "You're right about everything. I lost sight of why we were building wealth in the first place." "Did you ever actually know why? Or were you just building it because that's what you thought successful people were supposed to do?" The question cut deep, because it forced me to examine motivations I'd never seriously questioned. Had I been accumulating wealth because we needed it, or because I'd been programmed to believe that financial success was the primary metric of life achievement? Had I been optimizing our portfolio because it served our happiness, or because it was the only form of success I understood how to measure? "I thought I was providing security," I said, though the word sounded hollow even to me. "Marcus, we've been secure since you hit your first million. Everything after that was just hoarding. You were playing a video game with our life savings while I was living with fake budget constraints." Fake budget constraints. The phrase encapsulated the scope of my deception perfectly. Every spending decision I'd influenced, every dream I'd discouraged for financial reasons, every sacrifice I'd asked Victoria to make had been based on artificial limitations. We could have afforded anything she'd ever wanted, but I'd been too obsessed with accumulating money to allow us to actually use it. "What happens now?" I asked, though I suspected the answer hadn't changed despite this revelation. "Now you understand why I'm even angrier than I was yesterday." Victoria's voice hardened again. "It's one thing to lose your wife because you're a boring workaholic. It's another thing to discover that your boring workaholic husband was also lying about your financial situation while making you feel guilty for wanting to actually live your life." "I never meant to lie to you. You let me believe we couldn't afford things that represented pocket change to our actual financial situation. You made me feel selfish for wanting experiences we could have easily funded. That's not just lying, Marcus. That's financial manipulation." Financial manipulation. The accusation hit like a physical blow, because it was accurate.
I'd used information asymmetry to control our lifestyle decisions, just like I might manipulate a business negotiation by withholding key data from the other party. I treated my wife like a client who didn't need to know the full scope of our resources. Victoria, please, I know I made terrible mistakes, but we can fix this. We can travel, you can have your studio, we can move to California if that's what you want. We have the money to do anything. We've always had the money, Marcus. That's the point. You chose to hide it from me for years while watching me sacrifice things I wanted because I thought we couldn't afford them. Her voice broke slightly. Do you know how many times I didn't buy art supplies because I thought it was irresponsible? How many workshops I skipped? How many opportunities I passed up because you convinced me we needed to be more careful with money? Each question was an indictment of choices I'd influenced through deception. Victoria had been living below her means, not because we couldn't afford better, but because I'd created an artificial scarcity that served my need to control our financial trajectory. I can't undo those mistakes, I said quietly. But I can make sure they never happen again. With Trevor, they won't happen again. He might not have your money, but at least he's honest about what he can and can't afford. At least when he tells me we can't do something expensive, it's because we actually can't, not because he's decided to pretend we can't. Trevor again. The personal trainer who was honest about his financial limitations, while I'd been lying about our financial abundance. The man who offered genuine spontaneity within real constraints rather than artificial restrictions designed to optimize some secret accumulation strategy. Does he know about the money? I asked, though I wasn't sure I wanted to hear the answer. I told him tonight. His response was that $3 million doesn't matter if the person who has it treats you like a budget line item instead of a human being. She paused. He was right. Trevor was right. The money I'd been so proud of accumulating was meaningless if it never translated into actual life experiences or genuine happiness. I'd been optimizing for a score that didn't improve our daily reality, while ignoring the human being who was supposed to benefit from my financial success. What if I changed? I asked desperately. What if I learned to live differently, to be spontaneous, to use the money for experiences instead of just accumulating more? Marcus, you can't just decide to become a different person because your current personality cost you your marriage. Change takes time, and time is something we don't have. Trevor is moving in Monday morning, and I'm not going to put my life on hold while you figure out how to be human. Monday morning?
3 days from now, the personal trainer would be sleeping in the bed I'd shared with Victoria for 15 years, living in the house I'd optimized every detail of, enjoying the wife I'd taken for granted while chasing arbitrary financial targets. Could you at least postpone that decision? Give me a chance to show you I can be different? You've had 15 years to show me you could be different. Every time I tried to talk to you about feeling disconnected or wanting more spontaneity in our relationship, you'd redirect the conversation to our long-term financial goals. This isn't a decision I made lightly, Marcus. It's the result of years of feeling like I was married to a spreadsheet. A spreadsheet. Victoria's assessment was brutal and accurate. I treated our marriage like a financial plan to be optimized rather than a relationship to be nurtured. I'd measured success through asset accumulation rather than emotional connection. No wonder she'd fallen in love with someone who treated her like a woman instead of a variable in a portfolio management strategy. I understand why you're angry, I said, though understanding felt inadequate against the scope of damage I'd caused. Do you? Because I don't think you understand that this isn't just about the money, Marcus. It's about discovering that my husband of 15 years has been fundamentally dishonest about who he is and what our life together actually looks like. She was right again. The hidden wealth was just one symptom of a larger deception. I'd been presenting myself as a responsible provider who needed to make careful financial decisions, when in reality I was a wealthy man who'd chosen to live below our means for psychological reasons I'd never examined. Victoria had been married to a character I'd created rather than the person I actually was. "What kind of person hides $3 million from their wife?" she continued. "What kind of husband watches his wife deny herself things she wants because she thinks they can't afford them, when the truth is they could afford anything she could possibly imagine? The kind of husband who valued control more than honesty. The kind of man who treated financial planning like a strategic game rather than a tool for enabling happiness. The kind of person who'd forgotten that money was supposed to serve life, not the other way around. A selfish one, a controlling one, a man who lost sight of why financial success matters in the first place." "At least you're being honest now," Victoria said, though her voice carried no forgiveness. "Too bad it took losing your wife to make you realize what kind of person you'd become." The line went dead, leaving me alone in the hotel room with the full weight of my failures. Victoria was right about everything. I'd been dishonest, controlling, and so obsessed with financial optimization that I'd forgotten to optimize for the things that actually mattered. But she was wrong about one thing. I hadn't just realized what kind of person I'd become. I was beginning to understand what kind of person I needed to become, and more importantly, I was starting to formulate a plan for how to get there. Victoria thought she'd won by choosing Trevor's honest limitations over my deceptive abundance. She thought she'd found something real with a man who couldn't afford to give her the experiences I'd been withholding. What she didn't know was that her betrayal had awakened something in me that 15 years of financial success had never touched. For the first time in my adult life, I had a goal that couldn't be achieved through spreadsheet analysis or strategic planning. I needed to learn how to be human again, how to live spontaneously, how to use wealth as a tool for creating experiences rather than accumulating numbers. And I needed to do it well enough to show Victoria that the man she'd fallen in love with 15 years ago was still buried somewhere underneath the financial analyst who'd driven her away. The old Marcus would have approached this challenge through research and systematic analysis, probably reading relationship self-help books and creating optimization strategies for personal growth. The new Marcus was going to do something that terrified and exhilarated him in equal measure. I was going to start living impulsively, spending money on experiences instead of investments, making decisions based on what felt right rather than what could be justified through careful analysis. I was going to become the kind of man who could inspire love instead of just providing financial security. Victoria and Trevor thought they'd escaped to build a more authentic life together. They had no idea that their betrayal had unleashed something far more dangerous than my hidden wealth. They'd awakened my capacity for genuine change, and I was about to discover what $3 million could accomplish when deployed by someone who'd finally learned the difference between accumulating money and using it. The game was just beginning, and this time I wasn't playing for portfolio optimization. I was playing for something infinitely more valuable, the chance to become worthy of love again. And unlike my previous financial strategies, this one had no predetermined endpoint. I would keep changing, keep growing, keep becoming more human until Victoria realized that the boring spreadsheet husband was gone forever. What had emerged in his place was something neither of us had seen before: a wealthy man who'd finally learned how to live. The transformation began with small acts of rebellion against my own nature. Thursday morning, instead of reviewing quarterly projections, I walked into the most expensive art gallery in River North and bought a painting without asking the price. The gallery owner, a sophisticated woman in her 50s, seemed genuinely surprised when I pointed to a vibrant, abstract piece and said simply, "I'll take it." "Don't you want to know about the artist, the provenance, the investment potential?" she asked, clearly accustomed to buyers who treated art like another asset class. "I just know I like looking at it," I replied, which felt like speaking a foreign language. The painting cost $18,000, roughly what I used to spend on a car after months of research and price comparison. I paid with my Black American Express card and arranged for immediate delivery. The purchase felt reckless and exhilarating, like jumping off a cliff without checking the landing. For the first time in my adult life, I'd bought something purely because it brought me joy, rather than because it served some calculated purpose. The sensation was addictive. Over the following weeks, I systematically dismantled every constraint I'd imposed on myself and Victoria. I booked a first-class flight to Paris, not for business, but simply because I'd never seen the Louvre. I enrolled in cooking classes, not to optimize our meal costs, but because I'd always wondered what it would feel like to create something with my hands. I bought expensive wine and drank it on random Tuesday evenings while sitting in Grant Park, watching people live their unoptimized lives. Each impulsive decision felt like shedding skin, revealing someone who'd been buried under decades of financial responsibility. The Marcus that emerged was stranger to me, someone who could spend money without calculating returns, who could experience beauty without quantifying its value, who could exist in moments without planning the next strategic move. But the real revelation came when I started researching Trevor Blackstone, not out of jealousy, though that was certainly present, but out of professional curiosity about the man who'd stolen my wife while I'd been accumulating wealth. What I discovered changed everything. Trevor wasn't just a personal trainer living paycheck to paycheck. He was a personal trainer with ambitions that extended far beyond fitness coaching. His social media presence revealed a carefully curated lifestyle that suggested income sources beyond training clients twice a week. The motorcycle, the designer workout clothes, the expensive supplements he endorsed, none of it added up to what Victoria had told me about his honest financial limitations. I hired a private investigator, not to spy on Victoria, but to understand who Trevor really was. The report that came back 3 weeks later painted a picture that was both fascinating and deeply disturbing. Trevor wasn't his real name. He was Trevor Benson, originally from Phoenix, with a criminal record that included fraud charges from 5 years ago. The personal training business was legitimate, but it was also a front for something more sophisticated. Trevor specialized in targeting wealthy, unhappy wives who hired him for fitness coaching. The pattern was always the same: establish emotional intimacy, position himself as the spontaneous alternative to their financially focused husbands, then gradually gain access to their assets through marriage or direct financial manipulation. Victoria wasn't Trevor's first wealthy wife. She was his third. The previous two had lost substantial sums before discovering his true nature. One had lost her house in what appeared to be a fraudulent investment scheme Trevor had convinced her to join. The other had simply disappeared from Chicago after their brief marriage ended, leaving behind a cleaned-out bank account and a foreclosure notice. The investigators' report included photographs, financial records, and testimony from Trevor's previous victims. The man Victoria thought represented authentic spontaneity was actually running a sophisticated long-term con designed to separate wealthy women from their assets.
His honest financial limitations were a carefully constructed lie designed to make him seem more genuine than their financially successful husbands. Trevor had studied Victoria before targeting her. He knew about our wealth, our marital problems, my obsession with financial optimization. His entire persona, the spontaneous adventures, the live-in-the-moment philosophy, the criticism of my spreadsheet mentality, all of it had been calculated to appeal to a woman who felt trapped by her husband's financial control. The irony was devastating. Victoria had left me for a man who was everything she'd accused me of being, but worse. Where I'd hidden our wealth out of misguided control issues, Trevor was planning to steal it through emotional manipulation. Where I'd optimized our spending for long-term security, Trevor was optimizing his romantic strategy for maximum financial extraction. But the most disturbing part wasn't Trevor's deception. It was how perfectly his con had worked because of my own failures as a husband. My financial secrecy and control had created exactly the vulnerability Trevor needed to exploit. Victoria's desperation for spontaneity and authentic connection had made her the perfect target for someone who specialized in providing fake versions of both. I spent 2 days processing this information, walking through Chicago in a daze as I realized how completely I'd failed to protect the woman I loved. Not from external threats, which I'd prepared for through insurance and estate planning, but from my own emotional neglect that had made her susceptible to a predator who understood her needs better than her own husband. The old Marcus would have immediately called Victoria with evidence of Trevor's deception, probably creating a PowerPoint presentation with charts and documentation proving that her new love was a criminal. The new Marcus understood that approach would only confirm her opinion that I treated every problem like a business analysis. Instead, I developed a different strategy, one that would allow Victoria to discover Trevor's true nature herself, while demonstrating that I'd finally learned the difference between providing information and providing genuine support. The first step was positioning myself where Victoria could see the man I was becoming rather than the man I'd been. I started volunteering at the Art Institute, not because it would advance any career goal, but because I'd genuinely fallen in love with the experience of helping people connect with beauty. I took up rock climbing, partly because Victoria had mentioned wanting to try it, and partly because it required being present in each moment, rather than planning 3 moves ahead. I learned to cook, really cook, not just follow recipes, but understand how flavors worked together, and how food could be an expression of creativity rather than fuel for productivity. I started hosting dinner parties for new friends I'd met through volunteer work, people who knew nothing about my business success or financial portfolio, who valued me for my conversation and company rather than my professional achievements. Victoria noticed. She had to, because Chicago's social circles overlapped enough that word of my transformation reached her through mutual acquaintances. Linda Morrison, who worked at the Art Institute, mentioned to Victoria's sister that I'd become one of their most dedicated volunteers. The climbing gym instructor, who knew Victoria from her sessions with Trevor, told her that I'd progressed faster than any new climber he'd ever seen. But I didn't contact Victoria directly. Instead, I waited for her to reach out to me, which happened 6 weeks after our last phone conversation. She called on a Thursday evening while I was preparing dinner for 8 people I'd met in my cooking class. "Marcus, it's Victoria. I hope I'm not interrupting anything important." "Just cooking dinner for some friends," I replied, stirring risotto while balancing the phone against my shoulder. "What's going on?" "Friends? You're cooking dinner for friends?" The surprise in her voice was unmistakable. "Since when do you cook? Since when do you have friends who aren't business contacts?" "Since I realized that accumulating money without learning how to live was the stupidest strategy I'd ever developed," I said, adding wine to the risotto with a practiced motion that would have been impossible 2 months earlier. "I heard you've been volunteering at the Art Institute." 3 days a week. Turns out helping people discover art they love is more satisfying than optimizing investment portfolios. I tasted the risotto, adjusting the seasoning like the cooking instructor had taught me. "Who told you?" "Linda Morrison mentioned it to my sister. She said you've become quite the art enthusiast." Victoria's voice carried curiosity mixed with suspicion. "She also said you bought an $18,000 painting without asking any questions about its investment potential." "I bought it because it was beautiful. Amazing how much more enjoyable spending money becomes when you stop calculating the opportunity cost of every purchase." Victoria was quiet for a long moment. In the background, I could hear what sounded like Trevor's motorcycle pulling into the driveway. Our driveway. The thought still stung, but less sharply than it had 2 months ago. "Marcus, this doesn't sound like you at all. Maybe the person you were married to wasn't really me. Maybe it was just someone I thought I was supposed to be. Turns out the real me actually enjoys life when I stop treating it like a quarterly report." "I need to see you," Victoria said suddenly. "Can we meet somewhere tomorrow?"
I'm free for lunch. There's a new place in Bucktown I've been wanting to try. Nothing fancy, just good food and interesting atmosphere. The old Marcus would have suggested a business lunch downtown with predictable cuisine and efficient service. The new Marcus chose restaurants based on character rather than convenience. Okay, text me the address. After hanging up, I served dinner to my cooking class friends, people who knew me as someone who told stories about learning to appreciate art and ask thoughtful questions about their lives, rather than networking contacts who might advance my business interests. We talked about books and travel plans and philosophical questions that had no quantifiable answers. James, a retired teacher, mentioned that he'd never understood how people could work in finance without losing their souls. All those numbers and calculations, how do you find meaning in that kind of work? You don't, I replied. Honestly, you find meaning in spite of it, or you lose yourself trying to optimize everything, including your own humanity. The conversation continued late into the evening, ranging across topics I'd never discussed at business dinners: art, travel, relationships, the challenge of staying connected to what mattered while pursuing professional success. These people knew nothing about my wealth or business achievements, but they listened to my thoughts and shared their own with genuine interest. Walking them to the door at midnight, I realized this was what Victoria had been missing. Not just spontaneity or adventure, but authentic human connection that existed for its own sake rather than serving some strategic purpose. I'd built a successful business and accumulated significant wealth, but I'd forgotten how to simply enjoy the company of other people. Friday lunch with Victoria was scheduled for 1 o'clock at a small Italian place that had gotten great reviews for atmosphere rather than efficiency. I arrived 15 minutes early, not to scope out the location or review notes, but because I'd developed a habit of arriving early everywhere since learning to enjoy observing people and places without any particular agenda. Victoria walked in, looking different than I remembered. Still beautiful, but carrying a tension in her shoulders that seemed new. Her smile when she saw me was genuine but complicated, like someone greeting a familiar stranger. "You look good," she said, settling into the chair across from me. "Different. Relaxed." "I feel different," I replied honestly. "Less like I'm running calculations and more like I'm actually present for my own life."
Linda Morrison said you've become quite the art expert. She mentioned you spent 20 minutes talking to a patron about the emotional impact of abstract expressionism. Victoria studied my face like she was looking for evidence of deception. "Since when do you discuss emotional impact with strangers?" "Since I realized that understanding something intellectually isn't the same as experiencing it emotionally," I said, ordering wine without checking the price or vintage. Turns out there's a whole dimension of existence I'd been ignoring while focused on measurable outcomes. Victoria ordered pasta primavera, something she'd always loved but rarely ordered during our marriage because I'd typically chosen restaurants based on business networking potential rather than menu quality. We'd spent 15 years eating efficiently rather than enjoying food. "Trevor says you're probably having some kind of midlife crisis," she said, twirling pasta around her fork. "He thinks all this sudden lifestyle change is just a reaction to our separation." Trevor's assessment. I wondered how much Victoria had told him about my transformation, whether she'd mentioned the art gallery purchase or the cooking classes or the rock climbing, whether she'd mentioned that her boring financial analyst husband was learning to live spontaneously. "What do you think?" I asked, instead of responding to Trevor's amateur psychology. "I think you're either having a genuine breakthrough or you're putting on an elaborate performance to try to win me back." Victoria met my eyes directly. "I'm not sure which possibility scares me more." "Why would genuine change scare you?" "Because if you could become this person now, it means you chose not to be this person during our marriage." Her voice carried hurt that went beyond anger. "It means 15 years of me begging you to be more spontaneous, more present, more emotionally available, and you just decided you didn't want to be those things until losing me forced your hand." The accusation hit hard because it contained truth.
I had been capable of change all along, but I'd been too comfortable with my optimized lifestyle to see any reason to grow. It had taken losing Victoria to wake me up to possibilities I'd been ignoring. "You're right," I said simply. "I could have chosen to change years ago. I could have learned to value experiences over accumulation, presence over planning, emotional connection over financial optimization. I chose not to because I thought what I was doing was enough." Why wasn't I enough to motivate that choice? Victoria's question was quiet but devastating. Because I was an idiot who thought providing financial security was the same as providing emotional partnership, I replied. I confused being a good provider with being a good husband, and by the time I realized the difference, you'd already found someone who understood what you actually needed. Victoria was quiet for several minutes, eating pasta and watching people walk past the restaurant window. Outside, Chicago was busy with the energy of people living their optimized and unoptimized lives, pursuing success and happiness and connection through strategies both calculated and spontaneous. "Trevor wants to get married," she said finally. The words hit like a physical blow, but I managed to keep my expression neutral. "How do you feel about that?" Confused. 6 months ago, I would have said yes immediately. He represents everything I thought I wanted. Spontaneity, adventure, living in the moment instead of constantly planning for some distant future. Victoria set down her fork. "But lately, I've been wondering if there's a difference between being spontaneous and being reckless." "What makes you say that?" "Small things. He never plans anything more than a day ahead, which was exciting at first, but now it feels irresponsible. He spends money he doesn't have on experiences he says we deserve, then worries about paying rent. He's critical of anyone who thinks about long-term consequences, like planning for the future, is somehow inauthentic." I processed this information carefully. Victoria was beginning to see the downside of Trevor's approach to life, the way extreme spontaneity could become its own form of dysfunction. She was discovering that sustainable happiness required some balance between living in the moment and considering future implications. "He also asks a lot of questions about our finances, about the divorce settlement, about what you might be hiding, about whether I'm sure I understand our actual net worth. He says he wants to make sure you're not cheating me out of assets I deserve." There it was. Trevor positioning himself as Victoria's financial protector while gathering intelligence about the wealth he planned to target. I wondered if he'd started suggesting investment opportunities or business ventures that would require access to Victoria's settlement money. "What kind of questions?" I asked carefully. "Whether you might have hidden accounts, whether I should hire a forensic accountant to audit your financial disclosure, whether $3 million might just be the tip of the iceberg." Victoria watched my reaction closely. "He thinks you're the type of person who would hide significant assets to minimize what I receive in the divorce." Trevor was fishing, trying to determine the full scope of our wealth while positioning himself as Victoria's advocate. The $3 million she'd discovered was substantial enough to fund his scam, but he was hoping for more. Men like Trevor always hoped for more. "I could provide complete financial transparency. Full account statements, investment records, business valuations, everything. You could verify that what you found represents the total picture." "You do that?" "Victoria, you were married to me for 15 years. You contributed to our success in ways that don't show up on financial statements. Whether we stay married or divorced, you deserve to understand exactly what we built together." I meant it completely. I should have shared that information years ago instead of treating our wealth like my private accomplishment. Victoria studied my face like she was trying to read a foreign language. "Trevor said you'd probably resist full disclosure, that men like you always try to hide assets during divorce proceedings." Men like me. Trevor had been educating Victoria about the expected behavior of financially successful husbands, probably using stories from his previous scams to convince her that my secrecy was typical rather than specific to my particular psychological issues. "I'm not interested in hiding assets," I said honestly. "I'm interested in making sure you understand that our wealth exists to serve happiness, not the other way around.
If that means you use your share to build a life with Trevor, then that's what happens. You'd be okay with me using our money to start a new life with another man? The question was a test, and I understood that my answer would reveal whether my transformation was genuine or strategic. The old Marcus would have calculated ways to minimize Victoria's share or structure payments to retain control. The new Marcus understood that trying to control other people through financial leverage was exactly the kind of thinking that had destroyed our marriage. I'd be heartbroken, but I'd rather see you happy with money you can use freely than trapped in a relationship with someone who treats wealth like a weapon for controlling your choices. Victoria was quiet for a long time, finishing her pasta and watching people walk past the restaurant window. Outside, Chicago was busy with the energy of people living their optimized and unoptimized lives, pursuing success and happiness and connection through strategies both calculated and spontaneous. "Trevor wants to get married," she said finally. The words hit like a physical blow, but I managed to keep my expression neutral. "How do you feel about that?" Confused. 6 months ago, I would have said yes immediately. He represents everything I thought I wanted. Spontaneity, adventure, living in the moment instead of constantly planning for some distant future. Victoria set down her fork. "But lately, I've been wondering if there's a difference between being spontaneous and being reckless." "What makes you say that?" "Small things. He never plans anything more than a day ahead, which was exciting at first, but now it feels irresponsible. He spends money he doesn't have on experiences he says we deserve, then worries about paying rent. He's critical of anyone who thinks about long-term consequences, like planning for the future is somehow inauthentic." I processed this information carefully. Victoria was beginning to see the downside of Trevor's approach to life, the way extreme spontaneity could become its own form of dysfunction. She was discovering that sustainable happiness required some balance between living in the moment and considering future implications. "He also asks a lot of questions about our finances, about the divorce settlement, about what you might be hiding, about whether I'm sure I understand our actual net worth. He says he wants to make sure you're not cheating me out of assets I deserve." There it was. Trevor positioning himself as Victoria's financial protector while gathering intelligence about the wealth he planned to target. I wondered if he'd started suggesting investment opportunities or business ventures that would require access to Victoria's settlement money. "What kind of questions?" I asked carefully. "Whether you might have hidden accounts, whether I should hire a forensic accountant to audit your financial disclosure, whether $3 million might just be the tip of the iceberg." Victoria watched my reaction closely. "He thinks you're the type of person who would hide significant assets to minimize what I receive in the divorce." Trevor was fishing, trying to determine the full scope of our wealth while positioning himself as Victoria's advocate. The $3 million she'd discovered was substantial enough to fund his scam, but he was hoping for more. Men like Trevor always hoped for more. "I could provide complete financial transparency, full account statements, investment records, business valuations, everything. You could verify that what you found represents the total picture." "You do that?" "Victoria, you were married to me for..."
"He's been pressuring me to move faster on the divorce settlement," Victoria said. "He says waiting too long gives you time to hide assets or manipulate the process. He wants me to demand immediate liquidation of everything so we can start our new life without being tied to your business timeline." Immediate liquidation. Trevor was trying to force a quick conversion of assets to cash, probably planning to suggest investments or business opportunities that would give him direct access to Victoria's money. The pressure tactics were classic manipulator behavior, creating artificial urgency to prevent his target from thinking clearly about major financial decisions. "How does that make you feel?" I asked. "Pressured, like I'm being rushed into decisions I'm not ready to make." Victoria met my eyes. "And suspicious about why he's so interested in the financial details of my divorce. When I asked him to slow down, he got angry and accused me of still being emotionally attached to you." Trevor was losing patience. probably because his scam depended on maintaining momentum and preventing Victoria from examining his motives too closely. Men like him relied on keeping their targets emotionally off balance and financially dependent on their guidance. "There's something else," Victoria continued. "I've been having second thoughts about everything, about Trevor, about the divorce, about whether I made the right choice in leaving you." "What kind of second thoughts?" "The kind where I realize that being married to someone who plans everything isn't necessarily worse than being with someone who plans nothing." Victoria's voice carried exhaustion. "Trevor's spontaneity is exciting, but it's also chaotic. Everything is immediate gratification with no consideration for consequences. It's like living with someone who never learned to balance the present with the future." Victoria was discovering that Trevor's spontaneity was actually another form of dysfunction, the opposite extreme from my obsessive planning, but equally destructive to building sustainable happiness. She was learning that healthy relationships required both people who could live in the moment and consider long-term implications. "I've also been thinking about what you said, about learning to use money as a tool for experiences rather than just accumulating it," she continued. "Trevor doesn't understand that concept. To him, money is either something you hoard or something you spend impulsively. He doesn't get the idea of conscious, intentional choices about how wealth can serve happiness." This was my opening, but I proceeded carefully. Victoria needed to reach her own conclusions about Trevor rather than being convinced by my arguments, no matter how well documented they might be. "What would conscious, intentional choices look like for you?" I asked. "I don't know yet. Maybe traveling, but thoughtfully. Staying places long enough to actually experience them rather than just checking destinations off a list. Maybe supporting artists and causes I believe in. Maybe finally opening that studio and teaching art to people who can't afford expensive classes." Victoria paused. "Maybe figuring out how to balance security with adventure, instead of choosing one or the other." "Those sound like the dreams you've always had." "They are. But Trevor thinks supporting causes is a waste of money that could be spent on experiences. He thinks teaching art to poor kids is noble but impractical. He wants to spend our money on motorcycles and travel and living like we're still 25. Victoria looked out the window again. "Sometimes I wonder if he fell in love with me or with the lifestyle he thinks my divorce settlement will provide." There it was. Victoria was beginning to question Trevor's motivations without any input from me. The pressure tactics and financial focus were revealing his true character more effectively than any evidence I could have presented. "Have you talked to him about these concerns?" "I tried. He said I was being influenced by your financial trauma and then I needed to trust him to help me break free from your scarcity mindset." Victoria made air quotes around Trevor's therapeutic language. "He said questioning his financial input was just evidence that you'd trained me to be suspicious of spontaneous generosity." Trevor was using psychological manipulation to deflect Victoria's reasonable concerns, reframing her intuition as damage from her marriage to me. Classic gaslighting technique designed to make her doubt her own judgment about his increasingly obvious agenda. "What does your intuition tell you?" I asked. "My intuition tells me that spontaneous generosity shouldn't require access to my bank accounts," Victoria replied with a bitter laugh. "My intuition tells me that a man who really loved me would be more interested in my happiness than my net worth." Victoria was figuring that out, not because I'd presented evidence of Trevor's crimes, but because his behavior was becoming impossible to ignore once she started paying attention to his motivations rather than his romantic rhetoric. "I think I made a mistake," she said quietly. "Not just about Trevor, but about us. About assuming that changing you was impossible and that leaving was the only option." "People can change," I said carefully, "but only if they want to. And only if they're willing to do the work required for genuine growth rather than just performance." "How do I know if your changes are genuine?" The question hung between us like a bridge that could either reconnect us or collapse under the weight of past failures. Victoria was offering me a chance to prove that my transformation was real, but she was also testing whether I'd revert to manipulation and control when given the opportunity. "I don't," I said honestly. "You can't know for certain whether anyone's change is permanent. All you can do is observe behavior over time and decide whether the person someone is becoming is compatible with the life you want to build. And what kind of life do you want to build? One where we use our resources to create experiences and support causes we believe in, where we travel thoughtfully and live intentionally and balance security with adventure." I met her eyes directly. "One where I'm present for actual life instead of constantly optimizing for some theoretical future." Victoria was quiet for several minutes, finishing her wine while processing everything we'd discussed. The lunch crowd was thinning out around us, people returning to jobs and responsibilities and their own relationship challenges. "I need time to think," she said finally. "About Trevor, about us, about what I actually want my life to look like going forward. Take all the time you need. I'm not going anywhere. Trevor won't be happy about me pulling back from wedding plans. How Trevor feels about your choices isn't your responsibility. You're allowed to change your mind about major life decisions when you get new information or perspective." Victoria smiled for the first time since arriving, a genuine expression that reminded me of the woman I'd fallen in love with 15 years earlier. "When did you become so wise about relationships?" When I realized that treating people like portfolio positions was destroying everything I actually cared about. Turns out, emotional intelligence can be learned, just like financial analysis. It just requires different skills.
We parted outside the restaurant with a tentative hug, the first physical contact we'd had since the night she'd told me to pack my bags. Victoria felt smaller in my arms than I remembered, more fragile, like someone who'd been carrying stress she didn't know how to resolve. Over the following weeks, I continued my new routine of art volunteering, cooking classes, and rock climbing, but I also paid closer attention to Victoria's situation through mutual friends. Linda Morrison mentioned that Victoria had stopped attending Trevor's fitness sessions. Rebecca, Victoria's closest friend, told her husband that Victoria seemed confused about her relationship status and was asking a lot of questions about relationship red flags. I didn't contact Victoria directly, but I made sure she had opportunities to observe the person I was becoming. I organized a charity art auction through the museum, something the old Marcus would never have prioritized. I started teaching basic financial literacy classes for low-income families, using my expertise to help people avoid the predatory schemes that targeted vulnerable populations. The irony wasn't lost on me that I was helping other people recognize financial manipulation while my own wife was being targeted by exactly that kind of scheme. But Victoria needed to discover Trevor's true nature herself rather than being rescued by information I provided. The breakthrough came 6 weeks later, when Victoria called me at 11 o'clock on a Tuesday night. "Marcus, I need help. Not financial help, but actual help. Can you come over?" I drove to our house, the home I'd optimized every detail of, but hadn't entered since the night Victoria had told me to leave. Trevor's motorcycle wasn't in the driveway, and Victoria met me at the door looking exhausted and frightened. "He's gone," she said without preamble. "Trevor left 3 hours ago with my grandmother's jewelry and about $15,000 from my checking account." I followed her into the kitchen, where we'd had so many conversations about budgets and financial planning, where she'd told me our marriage was over. Now it looked different. Lived in, but not cared for, like someone had been occupying the space without maintaining it. What happened? I told him I wanted to slow down on wedding plans, that I needed more time to think about our future together. Victoria sat heavily in the chair where she'd delivered the ultimatum that had changed both our lives. He got angry and started demanding to know if you'd been contacting me, if you'd been poisoning me against him. Had I? No, which is what made his reaction so suspicious.
When I told him my doubts were based on my own observations rather than your influence, he accused me of being brainwashed by years of financial trauma. He said I was too damaged to recognize healthy spontaneity when I saw it. Trevor had overplayed his hand, probably because his timeline for the scam was being disrupted by Victoria's growing caution. Men like him relied on keeping their targets moving toward major financial decisions before critical thinking could interfere with emotional manipulation. Then what happened? I asked him point-blank why he was so focused on my financial situation and so eager to get control of my divorce settlement. Victoria's voice was steady but tired. He said I was being paranoid and suspicious, that questioning his motives proved I was still emotionally damaged from being married to a controlling man. And I realized that his response felt exactly like being married to a controlling man, just a different kind of control. Victoria looked up at me with eyes that had learned something painful about human nature. He wasn't answering my question, Marcus. He was attacking my right to ask it. Victoria had figured out the essential difference between my financial control and Trevor's emotional manipulation. Both were forms of control, but she'd learned to recognize the tactics that kept her from examining her own situation clearly. When I insisted on a real answer, he started talking about investment opportunities, business ventures we could pursue together once I had liquid assets from the divorce, Victoria continued. Schemes that required immediate cash investment and promised incredible returns. Everything sounded like the financial scams you used to warn me about. Trevor had been forced to reveal his endgame earlier than planned, probably because Victoria's resistance was threatening his timeline. The investment opportunities would have been fake ventures designed to separate her from her money while keeping her emotionally dependent on his guidance. I told him I wanted to research these opportunities independently before making any decisions, Victoria said. That's when he got really angry and said research was just another form of the financial paranoia you'd trained me to have. He said I was too damaged to recognize healthy spontaneity when I saw it. Ultimatums. Trevor had used the same manipulation technique Victoria had experienced with me, forcing her to choose between his agenda and her own judgment. But this time, she'd recognized the coercion and refused to accept artificial constraints on her decision-making process. What did you choose? I chose to trust my own judgment for once, Victoria replied with something that might be pride. I told him I needed space to think, that major financial decisions required careful consideration regardless of who was suggesting them. How did he react? He said if I couldn't trust him with money decisions, then I didn't really love him. He said real love meant complete faith in your partner's judgment, that questioning his financial advice was the same as questioning his commitment to our relationship. Sound familiar? It did sound familiar because it was exactly the kind of emotional manipulation I'd used to control Victoria's spending decisions during our marriage. The difference was that Trevor was using false romance to justify financial control, while I'd used false responsibility. Both approaches treated Victoria like someone who couldn't be trusted with information about her own financial situation. Then he left. Then he packed his things, took my jewelry, and cleaned out my checking account while I was in the shower. Victoria's voice carried exhaustion rather than anger. He left a note saying I'd chosen financial paranoia over love and that he couldn't stay with someone who'd been too damaged by financial abuse to recognize healthy partnership. Trevor had executed his exit strategy, taking what he could carry while blaming Victoria for the relationship's failure. The theft was probably calculated to be small enough to avoid serious criminal charges while still providing meaningful profit from his months of emotional investment. "I'm sorry," I said, meaning it completely. "You deserved better than being targeted by someone who understood your vulnerabilities well enough to exploit them. You deserved better from both of you," Victoria replied quietly. "Trevor was a predator, but you created the vulnerabilities he exploited. If you'd been honest about our finances and treated me like an equal partner instead of someone who needed financial management, I never would have been susceptible to his promises of financial transparency and partnership." She was right, and her analysis demonstrated how much she'd learned about the dynamics that had made their relationship possible.
Trevor's scam had worked because of legitimate grievances Victoria had about financial secrecy and control in our marriage. "You're absolutely right," I said. "I created the exact conditions that made Trevor's approach appealing to you. If I'd learned to share financial information and decision-making during our marriage, his promises of partnership wouldn't have seemed so attractive. The worst part is that I almost fell for it. I was so desperate for someone who seemed to value my input about money decisions that I ignored obvious red flags about his motivations. I wanted so badly to believe that someone could love me enough to trust me with complete financial honesty." "Someone can," I said quietly. "Someone should, years ago." Victoria looked at me with eyes that had learned something painful about human nature. "Do you mean that?" "I mean that you were right about everything. About my financial secrecy being a form of control. About me treating you like someone who couldn't be trusted with information about our own resources. About me using careful planning as an excuse to avoid present-moment connection." I met her eyes directly. "I mean that losing you taught me the difference between providing security and providing partnership." "And what's the difference?" "Security is something you give to someone you're protecting. Partnership is something you build with someone you trust as an equal." I paused, choosing my words carefully. "I was protecting you from financial decisions I thought you weren't qualified to make. I should have been partnering with you to make decisions that served both our goals." Victoria was quiet for several minutes, processing what I'd said while considering how it related to everything that had happened with Trevor. Outside, Chicago was settling into late evening quiet, the kind of peaceful moment I'd learned to appreciate instead of filling with productivity optimization. "I want to try again," she said finally. "Not to go back to who we were, but to see if we can build something better with who we've become." "Are you sure?" "You don't have to make that decision tonight, especially after everything that just happened with Trevor. I'm sure about wanting to try. I'm not sure about anything else. But I know that running away from our problems didn't solve them. It just taught me that the same problems exist with different people until you learn to solve them at the source." Victoria was right again. Her relationship with Trevor had been an attempt to escape the constraints of our marriage rather than address them directly. Now she understood that sustainable change required working through problems rather than around them. "What would trying again look like?" I asked. "Complete financial transparency for starters. No more hidden accounts. No more decisions about major spending without consulting each other. No more treating our resources like your private accomplishment." Victoria's voice was firm but not angry. "Equal partnership in every financial decision that affects our life together." Agreed completely. "And I want to use some of our money for things I care about. The art studio, teaching classes for low-income kids, maybe some travel that's about experiencing places rather than checking them off an optimization list." "We should do all of that," I said, meaning it. "We should use our wealth to fund the life you've always wanted, instead of the life I thought we should want. And you have to promise that you'll tell me if you start reverting to optimization mode, instead of just quietly resenting my spending choices," Victoria continued. "I need to know that you'll communicate about problems instead of just calculating them." "I promise. And you have to promise you'll tell me if you start feeling controlled or minimized instead of looking for escape routes that might not be genuine alternatives." Victoria smiled, the first genuinely happy expression I'd seen from her since before our marriage had started falling apart. "Deal. But I have one more condition." "What's that?" "We start with a trip, somewhere neither of us has been, somewhere we choose together based on what sounds interesting rather than what makes financial sense." Victoria's eyes lit up with possibility. "I want our first decision as genuine partners to be completely impractical and entirely about joy." "Where do you want to go?" "I've always wanted to see the Northern Lights in Iceland, not because it's practical or educational or good for networking,
but because the idea of standing under dancing green light in the middle of winter sounds magical. "Iceland it is," I said without hesitation. "When do we leave?" "You're not going to research the optimal time to visit or calculate the cost per experience hour?" Victoria asked with mock surprise. "I'm going to book the most romantic hotel I can find and plan absolutely nothing except being present with you under the most beautiful sky on earth. The old Marcus is officially retired." Victoria laughed, a sound I hadn't heard in so long that it took me a moment to recognize it. Real laughter, not the polite social version I'd been getting for years, but the genuine joy I'd fallen in love with when we were 25 and thought anything was possible. "There's one more thing," she said, her expression becoming serious again. "I want to file a police report about Trevor. Not because I expect to get the money back, but because he's probably going to target other women the same way he targeted me." She was right, and her decision to report Trevor, despite the personal embarrassment it might cause, showed growth in a different direction. The old Victoria might have chosen to quietly move on rather than face the public acknowledgement of being scammed. The new Victoria understood that protecting other potential victims mattered more than protecting her own pride. "I'll go with you if you want, as moral support, not as someone trying to control your decisions about how to handle this." I'd like that. "And Marcus, thank you for not saying 'I told you so' about Trevor. You would have been justified, but it wouldn't have helped. I didn't see Trevor coming any more than you did. I created the exact vulnerabilities he exploited. If anyone should have protected you from financial predators, it was the financial expert you were married to." "We both made mistakes," Victoria said, standing up and walking to the window that overlooked her rose garden. "I should have talked to you directly about feeling controlled instead of looking for someone who seemed like your opposite, and you should have treated me like a partner instead of someone who needed financial management. But we learned from them. That has to count for something." Victoria turned from the window and looked at me with an expression I couldn't quite read. "Marcus, there's something else I need to tell you. About the money Trevor took." "What about it?" "It wasn't really my money. I mean, it was in my account, but it came from the joint account you set up for household expenses. Technically, he stole from both of us." I processed this information, realizing that Trevor's theft was legally more serious than simple relationship fraud. Taking money from joint accounts without authorization was criminal in ways that would make prosecution more likely to succeed. "How much total?" "About $18,000, including the jewelry. Some of it was family pieces that belonged to my grandmother." Victoria's voice caught slightly. "I know they're just objects, but they were the only things I had left of her." $18,000 and irreplaceable family heirlooms. Trevor had calculated his exit strategy to maximize immediate gain, while ensuring Victoria would feel the loss on both financial and emotional levels. The cruelty was designed to punish her for resisting his timeline, rather than just profit from their relationship. "We'll get the jewelry back," I said with more confidence than I felt. "The money, probably not, but sentimental pieces are harder to fence without leaving traces." "How can you be sure?" "Because I know people who specialize in tracking down stolen property, and because Trevor isn't as smart as he thinks he is." I pulled out my phone. The private investigator I hired to research Trevor mentioned that he has patterns, including where he typically tries to sell stolen items.
Victoria stared at me. "You hired a private investigator? When?" I realized I'd revealed information I hadn't intended to share, at least not until Victoria had processed everything else that had happened. But the truth was going to come out anyway, and our new partnership required complete honesty, even when it might be uncomfortable. 3 weeks ago, I wanted to understand who Trevor really was, not to interfere with your relationship, but to understand what I was competing against. I met her eyes directly. I needed to know if he was genuinely better for you than I had been, or if he was just different in ways that seemed better. And what did you find?
I found that Trevor Blackstone isn't his real name, that you're the third wealthy woman he's targeted in Chicago, and that his previous relationships ended with significant financial losses for his partners. I paused, letting this information settle. I also found that everything about his spontaneous lifestyle was calculated to appeal to women who felt controlled by financially focused husbands. Victoria sat down heavily, processing the scope of Trevor's deception. You knew he was a con artist and you didn't tell me? I knew, and I almost told you a dozen times, I admitted. But every approach I considered sounded like me trying to win you back by destroying your new relationship. I was afraid you'd think I was making it up or manipulating evidence to serve my own agenda. You probably were right about that, Victoria said quietly. If you'd come to me with accusations about Trevor, I would have assumed you were trying to sabotage my happiness because you couldn't accept losing me. I was hoping you'd figure out his true nature yourself, that his behavior would eventually reveal inconsistencies you'd recognize. I looked down at my hands. I was also hoping that learning to trust your own judgment about relationships would be more valuable than being rescued by information I provided. Victoria was quiet for several minutes, considering what I'd said and what it meant about both my approach and Trevor's deception. You let me stay with someone you knew was dangerous because you thought I needed to learn independence? The question carried an edge that made me realize how my strategy might have looked from her perspective. I'd known Trevor was a predator and chosen not to warn Victoria directly, instead hoping she'd discover the truth herself. From one angle, that was respecting her autonomy. From another, it was allowing her to remain in danger to prove a point about personal growth. I let you stay with someone I knew was manipulative because I was afraid that rescuing you would confirm your opinion that I was controlling, I said honestly. I was more concerned with proving I'd changed than with protecting you from someone I knew could hurt you. That was the right choice, Victoria said, surprising me. If you'd tried to save me from Trevor, I would have resented the interference and probably married him just to prove my independence. Learning his true nature myself was the only way I could really understand what I'd gotten involved with. But you could have been hurt worse than losing money and jewelry. I could have been hurt worse by marrying someone I didn't really know because my ex-husband's interference convinced me he was being persecuted. Sometimes people have to make their own mistakes to understand why they're mistakes. She was right, but the conversation was making me realize how fine the line was between respecting someone's autonomy and failing to protect them from obvious dangers. I'd calculated that Victoria needed to discover Trevor's true nature independently, but that calculation had prioritized my relationship strategy over her immediate safety. I should have found a way to share the information without making it seem like manipulation, I said. Maybe. Or maybe there wasn't a way to do that given our history and my mindset at the time. Victoria stood up and began pacing around the kitchen. The important thing is that I figured it out before making any irreversible decisions. And now we file the police report and try to get your grandmother's jewelry back. And now we book a trip to Iceland and start learning how to be married to each other as the people we've become, instead of the people we used to be, Victoria corrected. The police report can wait until tomorrow. Tonight, I want to plan something impractical and romantic with my husband. My husband. Victoria was reclaiming our relationship terminology, signaling that she was ready to move forward as partners rather than separated spouses working through their issues. The shift felt significant, like crossing a bridge from one version of our marriage to another. We spent the next 3 hours at the kitchen table with my laptop, researching Iceland, not for optimal travel timing or cost analysis, but for the most beautiful places to watch the northern lights and the most romantic hotels to serve as base camps for aurora hunting. Victoria chose accommodations based on charm and location rather than efficiency, while I researched activities we could do together that neither of us had ever tried: ice cave exploration, thermal spring soaking, horseback riding across volcanic landscapes, cooking classes featuring traditional Icelandic cuisine. Everything we selected prioritized shared experience over practical value, adventure over optimization, presence over productivity. When should we go? Victoria asked, scrolling through photos of the aurora borealis dancing over snow-covered mountains. Next week, I said without thinking, before we lose momentum or start overthinking the decision. Victoria looked at me with genuine surprise. Next week? What about your work commitments, client presentations, the quarterly analysis deadlines you're always worried about? I've learned that work will always expand to fill available time, and clients will always create artificial urgency for projects that aren't actually urgent. I booked flights before I could reconsider the impulsive timing. But opportunities to rebuild your marriage under the northern lights don't come along very often. You just booked flights to Iceland leaving in 6 days without checking your calendar or calculating the cost impact? Victoria asked, watching me complete the purchase with something approaching awe. I just booked flights to Iceland because my wife suggested something magical and I decided her happiness was more important than my portfolio optimization. I showed her the confirmation screen. First class, because if we're going to be impractical, we might as well be comfortable while we're doing it. Victoria laughed again, that genuine sound I'd been missing for years. Who are you and what have you done with my husband? My husband learned that being right about money doesn't matter if you're wrong about everything else that makes life worth living, I replied, pulling her close for the first real kiss we'd shared since before our marriage started falling apart. 3 weeks later, we stood together on a frozen hillside outside Reykjavik, watching green light dance across the Arctic sky while snow fell around us like confetti. Victoria was wearing the traditional Icelandic sweater we'd bought together, and I was holding her hand while trying to understand how I'd ever thought portfolio optimization was more interesting than sharing magic with the person I loved. Was this worth $18,000? She asked, referencing both the money Trevor had stolen and the cost of our spontaneous Iceland adventure. This was worth everything, I replied, meaning it completely, including learning that some investments pay dividends that can't be measured in financial terms. The Northern Lights continued their ancient dance above us, beautiful and unpredictable and impossible to optimize. Around us, other couples were sharing the same moment, some probably on carefully planned vacations, and others on spontaneous adventures, all of them discovering that some experiences were valuable precisely because they couldn't be calculated or controlled. Victoria leaned against me, warm and solid, and present in a way she hadn't been for years during our marriage. "I love you," she said quietly. "Not the version of you that I thought I wanted you to become, and not despite the person you used to be, but because of who you chose to become when everything fell apart." "I love you too," I replied, watching aurora light reflect in her eyes. "And I love that we're rich enough to afford any adventure we want, and smart enough now to choose adventures that matter." Above us, the universe continued its light show, indifferent to our human drama, but providing the perfect backdrop for two people who'd finally learned the difference between accumulating wealth and living richly. We had $3 million, a renewed marriage, and absolutely no idea what tomorrow would bring. It was the most perfectly unoptimized moment of my life. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.